It's really such a joy to present tonight's speaker. I remember Ursula Goodenough when she was speaking at the Lutheran School of Theology and gave talks to our Zygon Center for Religion and Science. She's a delight to hear. She's one of those rare people who is both a biologist and a person that engages in religious thinking. She's professor of biology emerita at WashU. She retired to Martha's Vineyard in 2017. She taught cell biology and evolution. She worked on Chlamydomonas, which is a type of algae. She worked on algal biofuel processors. And yet at the same time, she developed a religious naturalism orientation. And a new edition of her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, How Life Emerged and Evolved, is coming out. She has 5 children and 9 grandchildren. Today, she's going to take us on an adventure looking at taking nature to heart, the religious naturalist orientation. And this is just a reminder to everybody, questions can be put in the Q&A box. You can ask them now, or you can ask them after her talk. Thank you. Ursula.
Hi. Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Maynard. Good afternoon, everybody. I am now going to start my presentation by finding share screen. Where are you? There you are. Okay, Taking Nature to Heart is the title of my presentation. And let me start by getting ourselves in the framework of what I'm going to talk about. I'm first going to present my understanding of what it means by a religious naturalist orientation by asking first what is meant by religious, then what is meant by naturalist, and then what happens when they are combined. And I will then proceed to present my version of this orientation as I've narrated it in my book, The Sacred Depths of Nature. So we human beings are narrative beings. We think in stories. And this is because we are unique in our use of symbolic language. So most animals communicate, most beings communicate, but we do so in this particular mode called symbolic language. And these symbols point to underlying meanings and understandings, and we organize and remember these understandings as language-based narratives. So we think in stories, we dream in stories, we follow instructions in stories. This is how we roll. And indeed, we even construct a narrative I self, an autobiographical self that wakes up in the morning and that we hear in our minds all the time. All of which leads us to Terry Deacon's wonderful aphorism: biologically, we are just another ape. Mentally, we are a whole new phylum of organism. And let me stress, this doesn't mean that we're a better organism. It's just that this is our particular mode of being. So, all right. So as it turns out, anthropologists have let us know that each religious tradition, and there have been thousands of them, has a core narrative, a mythos, a large story. And this story tells us how things are, which things matter. And once this story is embedded in the tradition, it is subject to 3 processes. Interpretations of it. What does the story mean? These are embedded typically in the mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. Spiritual responses to the mythos are also elicited via art, ceremony, and ritual, and again, administered by religious leaders. And finally, moral or ethical edicts are built into the fabric of the matrix mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. So, scientific inquiry has provisioned us with a mind-blowing new core narrative. And here's Loyal Rue's version of it. During the course of epic events, matter was distilled out of radiant energy, segregated into galaxies, collapsed into stars, fused into atoms, swirled into planets, spliced into molecules, mutated into species, compromised into thought, and cajoled into cultures. All of this is what matter has done as systems upon systems of organization have emerged over 13 billion years of creative natural histories. Loyal suggests that we call this everybody's story, because it is true for all of us on the planet. So a vanilla naturalist takes this story seriously, takes this story to mind, and a religious naturalist also, in addition to taking it to mind, explores everybody's story for its religious potential along these same three axes. The interpretive, what does this story mean? The spiritual, how does this story make me feel inside? And the moral, how does this story suggest how I should act with others? So a religious naturalist takes nature to mind and takes nature to heart. So this idea of being a religious naturalist has a long history. We could go back to some of the Greeks and Romans and find elements of it. But the use of this term, religious naturalist orientation, has come back into familiarity. And in 2017, several of us, in fact, set up a nonprofit called the Religious Naturalist Association, or RNA, to bring us together and to orient people in this idea and encourage others to join us. So the religious naturalist orientation is told in many different voices. There is no religious naturalism, although that's kind of a convenient way to refer to it sometimes. But there are lots of different ways that people in particular interpret this story, feel about this story, and the moral lessons that they glean from it. And some of these voices indeed use theistic language, pantheism, panentheism, Gaianism. There are lots of ways that God language can be introduced. M.J. Rubenstein, the book listed here, does a brilliant job of examining all of these, what she calls pantheologies. My contribution is not theistic, and so that's the other alternative. So here's the table of contents of the book that was just published a few months ago. And there are 13 chapters, and as you read down them, you will see that what it is basically doing is telling everybody's story, the origins of the earth, of life, how life works, how an organism works, how evolution works, the evolution of biodiversity, awareness and the I self, interpretations and feelings, sex, intimacy, multicellularity and death, human evolution, human morality, and eco-morality. At the end of each of these chapters, after I have explained as best as I can how these features of everybody's story are best explained, I offer what I call a reflection, usually in a spiritual voice, but sometimes interpretive or moral, that give my own personal response to everybody's story. So what I'm going to do is just dig right in and go through. I will be using illustrations from the book and figures from the book as well. So chapter 1, origins of the Earth, starting with Big Bang, going through galaxies, and finally the Earth. And in my reflections, I talk about the fact that when I first learned this cosmology story, it basically freaked me out as a young person. It was all too scary, and I didn't like it and tried to not think about it. And in fact, as I write, when I later encountered the famous quote from physicist Steven Weinberg, quote, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless," I wallowed in its poignant nihilism. And then I go on to say the following. But since then, I have found a way to defeat the nihilism that lurks in the infinite and the infinitesimal. I've come to understand that I can deflect the apparent pointlessness of it all by realizing that I don't need to seek a point in any of it. Instead, I can see it as the locus of mystery. The mystery of why there is anything at all rather than nothing. the mystery of where the laws of physics came from, the mystery of why the universe seems so strange. Mystery, inherently shrouded in its own absence of category, its own absence of an answer. Mystery generates wonder, and wonder generates awe. The gasp can terrify, or the gasp can emancipate. As I dwell within cosmic and quantum mystery, I wander back through the centuries and counter the essence of Lao Tzu. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one sees the manifestations. These two spring from the same source, but differ in name. This appears as darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gate to all mystery. Okay, so that's how we're going to do it as we go through the rest of the chapters. The next chapter is the origins of life, where people currently think that it might have originated in deep sea vents, like the ones pictured on the right, on the left. And on the right, there are diagrams from the book showing a hypothesis, starting with Francisco Varela and then expanded greatly by Terence Deacon, on a possible model for how life originated. So in the upper right, we have something called an autocatalytic cycle, where the blue A is a catalyst. It enhances the rate of reactions. And it is catalyzing those two little orange squares into making something called B. B, it turns out, is a catalyst that can take the diamonds and catalyze it to make molecule C, and molecule C can catalyze the blue ovals to make A, and then it goes round and round and round, making more and more catalysts from these little substrates that are coming in from the outside. The bottom shows a more elaborate version of such an autocatalytic cycle with catalysts forming from substrates. And Deacon also suggests that these catalysts become enclosed in a container, sort of looking like a virus, to protect them from damage and allow them to work. So in the context of the origins of life, I introduced the concept of emergence, where the t-shirt slogan is something else from nothing but. So these substrates, as they join together to make, let's say, catalyst A, catalyst A has different properties, catalytic properties, that the nothing buts, the little substrates, don't have. There is a position that formation and morphology that allows the catalysis to work. So we get emergent properties showing up, even in this first form of life, and we also get emergent dynamics. A dynamic is something that happens through time. So the dynamics here is the operation of the cycle, the enclosure of the catalyst inside a container. And we get something that Terry calls an autogen, a candidate, very first life form. So emergence then is also another t-shirt slogan, nature's mode of creativity. And here's a reflection. The origin of life has long been considered a miracle wrought by God or gods or spirit. Now we can understand as the perhaps inevitable consequence of our entangled thermal and chemical context, our planetary matrix, that fostered and continues to foster life's emergent properties and emergent dynamics. Miracle, from the Latin miraculum, in fact means an object of wonder. We can gasp in wonder at the miraculous origin of life without the need to invoke supernatural design or agency. Each life form is a self, even the autogen, and each self has aims, has a purpose, to self-maintain, to self-protect, to self-repair, and self-reproduce. In many religious contexts, purpose is spelled with a capital P, as in what is the purpose of my life. The religious naturalist instead joins the East Asian and indigenous religions in dwelling with a lowercase understanding of purpose. The exuberant, purposive dynamics that spring forth from every creature, every self, and infuse our every moment. Chapter 3. So the way life works is through shapes, as we said when we were talking about the original autogen hypothesis. Here on the upper left, we have part of an antibody protein that's folded in a particular shape, and it's interacting with a portion of the spike protein of our good friend, the coronavirus. Underneath is a diagram of an enzyme with its catalytic folds that fit the substrates in and join them together to make new kinds of molecules. And these enzymes have evolved incredibly over the course of evolutionary history to the point where now in our own bodies, we have metabolic pathways that look something like this. You can't read any of it, but you get the drift that there are many pathways for creating all of the substances in our bodies, and they move via the catalytic properties of thousands of different kinds of enzymes. Reflection. We are told that life is so many manifestations of biophysics and biochemistry, and many of us shudder, a long existential shudder. And then we defend. We dig in our heels and say, no, that can't be all it is. That does to life what astrophysics does to the night sky. Life reduced to its component molecules is life demeaned. Stop saying things like that. For me, a helpful way to think about reductionism is to invoke what we can call the Mozart metaphor. A Mozart piano sonata is a wondrous thing, beautiful beyond belief, sonorous, resonant, transporting. But it is also about notes and piano keys. Mozart's magnificent brain conceived the work, to be sure. He then transcribed it into black specks on white paper to be translated into strings hit by tiny hammers to create vibrations heard by ears. We can thrill to a sonata without giving a thought to its notes, but we can also open up a score and follow the notes or play them ourselves without having the music diminished or demeaned. It is another way of experiencing the whole, and indeed the only way to have a full understanding of what the sonata entails and what Mozart had in his mind. So again, emergence, something else from nothing but. The notes are hammered by the piano keys, nothing but, and out flows the sonata, something else. Our attention might focus downward on the genome sequence of a wild rose, nothing but, and then shift upward to take in some emergent flowers, something else, and then go back down to the cytoplasmic compartments swollen with red pigment, nothing but, to give the petals their flush, something else. We reduce to understand the players, and then synthesize to understand their emergent properties and dynamics, and then find another occasion to reduce. How did Mozart generate that modulation into B flat? Ah, with that chord. How lovely. I then talk about how organisms work, the amoeba, a single-celled organism in the upper left, and then the multicellular plants and animals, where we have a sea urchin embryo at the 4-cell stage. And I talk about the key role of receptors, shown here as little wrench-shaped proteins that span membranes that take in signals from the outside of the cell and transmute them into signals on the inside of the cell to tell the cell how to behave, what to metabolize, what to do. I have come to understand that the self, myself, is inherently sacred by virtue of its own improbability, its own miracle, its own emergence. I start with my egg cell, one of 400,000 in my mother's ovaries, each one of them different. It meets with one of the hundreds of millions of different kinds of sperm cells produced each day by my father. Astonishing that I happened at all, truly astonishing. And then I cleave, I implant in her uterus, I grow tiny fetal kidneys and a tiny heart. The genes of my father and the genes of my mother switch on and off again in all sorts of combinations, all sorts of chords and tempos to create something both eminently human and eminently new. Once I am born, my unfinished brain slowly completes its maturation in the context of my unfolding experience. And during my quest to understand what it is to be a person, I come to understand that there can be but one me. And so I lift up my head and I bear my own witness with affection and tenderness and respect. And in so doing, I sanctify myself with my own grace. To the extent that I know myself, I am known. Any yearnings to be capital K known are relegated to the corridors of arrogance. And I sing my own song with profound gratitude for my existence. So once you have an autogen that emerges from the planetary matrix in the bottom model, this orange proto-life form, which we would be calling an autogen, probably showed up about 3.7 billion years ago, or about 1 billion years after the Earth first started taking shape. And this autogen, this self with aims and so on, then proceeded to evolve, changing its ways to better suit its environment or environments. Most of these evolved evolutionary ideas were a bust and didn't work. But what we know is that there was one lineage that generated a kind of creature called the last universal common ancestor, or the Luca. We call this the last universal common ancestor because it gave rise to the 3 lineages that now dominate modern life. It gave rise to the bacteria that you're familiar with, to the archaea, another single-celled critter that you may not be familiar with, and the archaea and the bacteria then fused together in interesting ways to form the lineage called eukaryotes, which includes the human and most of the animals we're familiar with, all the animals we're familiar with. So if you look at how the archaea and the eukaryotes and the bacteria work, we find that they're all made up of cells with membranes. They all have DNA and RNA and proteins. They perform many of the same metabolic functions, have many of the same structures. And so we can conclude, going backwards, that there must have been a Luca that also had all of these shared features and then branched off into these 3 major radiations. So here we see the family tree of the bacteria on the top, the archaea to the left, and the eukaryotes are all squinched into a narrow part at 5 o'clock. And the Luca would be somewhere there in the middle, giving rise to these 3 radiations. The radiations have been astonishing in both the bacteria and the archaea. And here we have the eukaryotes. So in the upper left, the Luca is somewhere there in the middle, and we start giving off eukaryotic critters where the bacteria and the archaea are this time squinched into a little sector at 5 o'clock. But we have the protists and the fungi and the plants and the animals all giving rise to more and more kinds of creatures out to the modern times. The artists of this figure have enlarged the upper left quadrant in the second panel so that you now see you are here and going up into the animal world. The lower left, it's enlarged even more. The lower right, it's enlarged so that we can actually read it. And Homo sapiens is flanked by 2 rodents to the right and 2 amphibians to the left. So the diversity of the eukaryotes is astonishing. The diversity of the bacteria is astonishing. I walk through the woods and the creatures are everywhere, seen and unseen, flying about or pushing through the soil or rummaging under the leaf litter, adapting and interacting and reproducing. I open my senses to them and we connect. I don't need to anthropomorphize them nor to value them because they are beautiful or amusing or needed for my survival. I see them as they are. I understand how they work. I think about their genes switching on and off, their cells dividing and differentiating in pace with my own, homologous to my own. I take in the sycamore by the river and I think about its story, the ancient versions of algae and mosses and ferns that came before, the tiny first life form that gave rise to it and to me. I try to guess why it looks the way it does, why the leaves are so serrated and the bark so white, and imagine all sorts of answers, all manner of selections and adaptations that have yielded this tree to existence and hence to my experience. Blessed be the tie that binds. It anchors us. We are embedded in the great story of biological evolution, the spare, elegant process of mutation and selection and bricolage. And this means that we are anything but alone. The next chapter is awareness. 2 of our wonderful creatures from Martha's Vineyard are shown in the left. The right is the evolution of the vertebrate brain, where obviously the major thing that's happening is that the human cortex is getting a lot bigger, but all of the other parts are the same. It all just got more and more complicated. As a non-theistic religious naturalist, I call upon the concept of emergence to help me understand the widespread sense that humans have immaterial souls that can interact with immaterial spirits and can continue their existence after the death of the body. The emergentist approach suggests that to experience our experience without perceiving its underlying material mechanisms, the neural hormonal collaborations, is the kind of thing one might expect of emergent dynamics. While the outcome has been given reverent names like spirit or soul that conjure up the apparent absence of materiality, we need not interpret this as evidence of some parallel immaterial world. We can now say that the experience of soul or spirit as immaterial is a reflection of the way the process of emergence distances each new level from the details below. Given such understandings, I have no qualms about referring to myself, sense of myself, as my soul. A soul emergent from material and biological complexity, a soul that will die when my body dies, but nonetheless a soul provisioned with endless opportunities for what some call imminent experience and others describe as a fullness, an overwhelming richness. The concept that these experiences entail access to some independent spiritual realm doesn't resonate with me, whereas to think of the mystical dimension as emergent from my mind and heart makes it all the more wondrous and exciting to be a human. I'm called to access the mysticism inherent in my participation in the planetary matrix. Interpretation and feeling. Above, we see a baby bonobo expressing fear because some older bonobos in the zoo have been chasing him and terrorizing him, clinging to his mother's fur. And below, we see a blue-footed Booby, excuse me, from the Galapagos doing his mating dance, and I would say his feelings have to do with joy. A feeling state that accompanies most religious frames of mind is variously known as empathy, compassion, humaneness, or loving kindness. The ability to imagine what it is like for another being to feel distress, the ability to put oneself in another's shoes and experience their distress in one's own being, and the impulse to help ameliorate that distress. Empathy has deep roots. Versions of empathy have often been witnessed in other mammals and in birds, and are particularly evident in non-human apes. A young bonobo was observed to fatally injure a bird while playing with it. She picked up the comatose body, carried it with her to the top of a tree, and opened out her hand. When the bird still lay there limply, she wrapped her legs around the tree trunk, held the bird by its wings, and then opened and closed the wings several times, apparently trying to help it start to fly. It is as we can imagine being the least of these that we can begin to experience the anguish of poverty or deprivation. It is as we are able to identify with the oil-soaked shorebird and the bewildered moose and the stranded polar bear that they come to embody our environmental concerns. And accompanying our sense of compassion, often at variance with our self-focused aims, is our haunting sense that things should be fair. So I go through the whole Mendelian sex thing, and that probably put you to in meiosis, probably put you to sleep in science class. Some of you and others of us were fascinated. But anyway, I tell the story of the evolution of sex in eukaryotes. And then I come to this. We have thus far considered two ways to think about caring for others. We have acknowledged our deep genetic homology with all of life and the affinity, the fellowship that emerges from that knowledge. We have also celebrated our capacity to experience empathy with other creatures and respond to their concerns as our own. And now we encounter our biological imperative to nurture our offspring, sacrificing, if need be, our lives on their behalf. It seems likely that the emotions evoked when we absorb our evolutionary affinity with other creatures and when we are infused with compassion will turn out to map closely onto the pathways that drive our basal, parental, and nurturing instincts. Emotions that generate such feelings as tenderness and warmth and protectiveness. These same emotions extend to our understanding that the Earth, the planetary matrix, must be nurtured as well. I talk about intimacy, the intimacy of mother-child, or these two parents, parental albatrosses with their baby, and all of the features of intimacy in our human lives. Given the complications of human-style intimacy, an enormous attraction of theistic religions has been that they offer the opportunity for intimate relationship with the deity or deities. Indeed, they often suggest that the most stable and fruitful outlet for intimacy is with the divine. These relationships can be abstract, as in indigenous prayers to cosmic concepts like the Great Spirit or the Mother Earth, or they can be intensely personal, as in the devotion accorded to Krishna and some Hindu traditions. But in the end, such faith isn't available to me. I can't go there. I lack the resources to render my capacity for love and my need to be loved to supernatural beings. And so I have no choice but to pour these capacities and needs into thick relationships with human and non-human beings, fragile and mortal and difficult as they can sometimes be. Earthly intimacy is a gift. It fills our lives with experiences of loving and being loved in all sorts of beautiful and fulfilling ways. Multicellularity and death. So single-celled organisms don't have to die, they just divide in two, whereas multicellular organisms like land plants and mammals and animals have two kinds of parts to their body: the soma, the body itself, and then the germline, where the meiosis takes place, the gametes, the eggs and sperm are produced, and it is the gametes that, and the eggs and sperm, that then have the job of going to the next generation. This means that the soma is free to evolve into being sort of anything it wants, anything that best suits the interests of that particular lineage and organism. But the soma isn't necessary to keep life going, and so the soma usually has a program that has it die. So in the upper part, we see a corn plant with its germline ready for the next generation, and the leaves and stems dying, and we see the dead leaves of our trees. So our brains, and hence our minds, are destined to die with the rest of the soma. And it is here that we arrive at one of the central ironies of human existence, which is that our sentient brains are capable of experiencing deep regret and sorrow and fear at the prospect of our own death. Yet it was the invention of death, the invention of the germ-soma dichotomy, that make possible the existence of our brains. Sex without death gives you single-celled algae and fungi and protists. Sex with a mortal soma gets you the rest of the eukaryotic creatures. Death is the price paid to have oaks and clams and geese and grasshoppers. And death is the price paid to have human-style consciousness, to be aware of all that shimmering awareness and all that love. My somatic life is the wondrous gift wrought by my forthcoming death. Chapter 12, Human Evolution. Here is our lineage. At the bottom is the common ancestor to the great ape lineage, and the orangutans branched off about 15 million years ago. The gorilla branched off about 11 million years ago, and the human branched off about 7 million years ago, where the dashed line shows the common ancestor between the human and the two other closest cousins, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, who diverged about 2 million years ago. If we start with that common ancestor and go out to the human, there were many experiments over the course of about 7 million years. We get Australopithecus, we get Homo erectus, and so on. And then we get Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis, who showed up about the same time, about 300,000 years ago. And as you know, we did some interbreeding with them, and then they went extinct, and we are now the only Homo species on the planet. The skull shows one found in Ethiopia about 160,000 years ago. The multiple human migrations out of Africa began only 100,000 years ago, and the European migrations only 54,000 years ago. And those migrants were all fully Pan-African. Psychologist Jeffrey Miller says it well. It should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. All of the significant evolution in our species occurred in populations with brown and black skins living in Africa. At the beginning of hominin evolution 7 million years ago, our ape-like ancestors had dark skin just like chimps and gorillas. When modern Homo sapiens showed up 300,000 years ago, we still had dark skins. When brain sizes tripled, they tripled in Africans. When sexual choice shaped human nature, it shaped Africans. What language, music, and art evolved, they evolved in Africans. Lighter skins evolved in some European and Asian populations long after the human mind evolved its present capacities. Afrocentrism is an appropriate attitude to take when we are thinking about human evolution. Our fully shared, fully ligated humanity, our deep kinship, is a foundational concept, and when absorbed, a potent counterforce to systemic and structural racism. And the last chapter is called Eco-Morality and Eco-Morality, where this photograph shows a little human sculpture poised at the edge of this roaring river in California and symbolizes for me our place in the whole. I talk about human morality and then eco-morality, which is our way of interacting with the rest of the planet. The Senegalese conservationist Baba Diom summarizes the foundational tenets of eco-morality. In the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. We have lifted up earlier our deep inborn affinity with the natural world. Baba Diom calls us to interweave this sensibility with our deepening knowledge of the natural world, creating narratives and teachings that help us all to understand what it is that we love, and then to insist that its sacred presence be conserved for future generations. The premise of this book, which I lead off with and conclude with, is that were everybody's story to be fully absorbed in a spiritual, interpretive, and moral way by we humans on the planet, that this would be a wonderful grounding for having planetary conversations about planetary ethics, about planetary solutions to the grave problems that we are now facing as a planet. And this is why I try to help people understand that this religious naturalist orientation is an option, not only for individuals, but perhaps in my fantasies for the planet as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ursula. That was really fabulous. And I'm seeing some hands go up in the audience. What a tour de force. We have a respondent today to your talk, and it's J.D. Hansen. He's policy director for the International Center for Technology Assessment. He's responsible for assessing new technologies like synthetic biology, new genetic engineering techniques, and human genetic research. But at the same time that he does that, he's also chaired the National Council of Churches Committee on Genetics and served on the World Council of Churches Bioethics Committee. He's attended every United Methodist General Conference since 1984, and he authored the resolution that called on the United Methodist Church to repent of its past support of eugenics. So JD, why don't you get started?
Well, it's wonderful to be invited to be with you tonight. I appreciate your contribution to this. I am a theist, but I certainly appreciate the rich contribution that throughout the history of religion, there have been other persons that have contributed tremendously. And particularly, I'm particularly fond of biologists. Today is the 87th birthday of my major biology professor as an undergraduate. He taught me that the most important human trait probably is curiosity, and the passion about how things work is shared across the planet. So he's Stephen C. Anderson. He is a herpetologist, and asks questions about how reptiles and amphibians evolved. And but even he missed some interesting things when he was going to Iran. He is the last U.S. herpetologist that went to Iran before the Shah was deposed. He was convinced that some of the snakes that he was looking at had accidentally had spiders packed in with them. And when he got to Iran, he found out there are 3 species of a venomous snake that uses a fake spider on its tail to attract birds to attack it. Now, I've never seen these snakes, but they've managed to make it on their tail end something that looks exactly like a spider. And that's one of the most incredible evolutionary things that I know, but there are many others. I lead a group for our local church called Spirit in Nature Group. And we do reflections on nature every Saturday morning. No, excuse me, every first Saturday of the morning. And we thank God for having created nature, because it is just so wondrous. My professor Anderson and one of my best friends I was just on a conference with don't believe in God as I do at all, but they are curious, and they want to understand how these chemicals that make us work. And both of these men don't want to destroy creation. And I was just on a conference call with not Anderson, but the other one, about a new nano-enabled pesticide to kill beetles that bother potatoes. And they're going to be releasing it right out where I vacation in Chicoutimi, Virginia. It's nothing that that ever could have evolved, and it's being released right where there are some endangered beetles. Now, my my friend is not a a deist at all, but he is a good scientist, and he just thinks it's awful that the Environmental Protection Agency is allowing this to be released as a so-called biopesticide with so little understanding of how this chemical works. And so I think one of the challenges we all have is how do we protect the planet and the life on this planet for the long term. And it's my response message on my email, personal email, quotes Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman is African American who founded a church in San Francisco in 1940 before he became the head of Boston School of Theology. A fellowship for all people, and the people that even that church still exists. If you go there, you don't have to believe a bit about theology. You have to believe that you need to care for each other and you need to care for the planet. And it's been going on since 1940. Howard Thurman learned from his enslaved grandmother that you could talk to trees and they would talk back to you. And he saw what he called God speaking to him through those big oak trees on the Daytona Beach. And there's enough rambling for a while, but I am so glad that Dr. Goodenough has done such extensive research and in helping us be more curious and appreciate the awe that makes all of these creatures. And I'll leave it at that, other than to say I start every morning sitting out with my coffee and on my porch so I can listen to birds. And the bird migration has started where I live in Northern Virginia. And we're getting hawks that I don't normally see. And this morning, in just 20 minutes, 4 different species of woodpeckers stopped by. And there's such diversity just in the thousands of species of birds, to say nothing of the millions of bacteria and fungi that we haven't even labeled yet. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, JD. Ursula, are there any comments you want to make after hearing JD's words?
Well, I'll just say one thing. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. I'll just say one thing, which is that persons, particularly in monotheistic faiths, tend to think of nature as excuse me, tend to think of nature as God's creation. That's a short term for it. And those of us who are approaching it from the everybody's story think of it as something that happened as a consequence of biochemistry and biophysics, and have the origin be a mystery, as I had in my first chapter. Some people think this is a really big, huge difference, and that we all have to go to conferences and try to figure out some resolution to this. And I have a very different perspective, which is that if I'm at, let's say, a river cleanup, and a group of people from my local churches are there, and I'm there, and they are there because the river is God's creation, and I am there because the river is has evolved. That's fine. That's fantastic. The point is that we are both acting on our belief of the sacredness of the earth, whether by God's blessing or by biochemistry, and we are all joining together to remediate things that humans have done to denigrate this sacred earth and its creatures. So I don't think that the interpretation of the fact that there's all of this diversity, and your theistic mind and my non-theistic mind, we both totally get off on the birds and and helping them and so on, and that moving forward is a wonderful way to proceed. The reason I lift up everybody's story is that it's not incompatible with notions of God as creator. It just is more complicated than just saying in 6 days, here it is. Okay, so, you know, there's a lot more to think about in taking the evolutionary story, everybody's story, and considering it from particularly a monotheistic perspective. But that doesn't mean that there's incompatibilities. It just means that there are different streams.
Okay, thank you both.
Yeah.
We have quite a few questions. I'm sorry, JD, you want to say something, please?
Yeah. At one point in my life, I was a student of Zen Buddhism, and my Zen Buddhism doesn't have a deity. I mean, there are other parts of Buddhism that do have something like a deity, but my master, to his credit, knew me better than I knew me. He kept referring to me as his Methodist monk, and he was willing, as a Zen Buddhist, to have a Methodist monk and tolerate my curiosity, and support it. And I think we all need to have that kind of support of people who think about God and think about the planet differently than ourselves, but also want to help save it.
Okay, thanks to both of you. I think this was a really great conversation, discussion. There are some questions in the question box, and I want to encourage anybody that wants to ask a question to type it in now. But let's start off. I think, Ursula, this is directed toward you. What do you think the religious, spiritual, and moral implications of programmed human aging and death are?
Well, human aging and death, it's not just humans that do that. It's all multicellular beings that do that. This, as I tried to explain, it probably may have gone too fast. The soma does its thing, and then the germline continues to the next generation, and the soma, because it's so specialized, it makes parts that just don't last. That, you know, there are just so many times a heart can beat before, I mean, give it a break. And so aging and the ultimate death is a part of the life cycle of all multicellular organisms. And if we want to look for a point to it, the point is that by giving over the transmission to the next generation, by segregating that into the germline, this has allowed our somatic bodies, in our particular human case, to include this tripling of brain size and this acquisition of symbolic language and all of the other cool things that we do. But it's still a soma, and it's still programmed to die.
Great, thank you. Next question. Do you think your ideas have changed since your first publication of Sacred Depths?
Not my core theological or existential ideas. I've certainly learned a huge amount, both by reading, by giving conference presentations and talks, by hanging out on Star Island and all the other things that I've been doing. So that I hope that the second edition reflects that maturation on my part. I've also been challenged by people who questioned some of the premises that I was making in my religious quest, and I've learned a great deal from those challenges. So I think I'm older and wiser. The science has changed some as well. We now know a huge amount more about the evolutionary trajectories than we did 25 years ago. We know a lot more about the cosmos, although that may be changing as we speak. But at the moment, we have a pretty good story anyway. And so I would say that the book is at least 60% different from the original.
Great, thank you. There's another question about your book. In chapter 4, you wrote, quote, "Any attempt to be known, I relegate to the corridors of arrogance," unquote. I agree, since the initiative is that of the knower, and the person made it a capital K, the knower. Is that behind your thought?
Well, what I was referring to is that there are some strands of religious orientation where the whole idea is to have a personal relationship with a God and to be known, a capital K known. And in that, the beginning of that reflection, I actually talk about a baptismal ceremony and how the minister talks about how the little baby that is being baptized is known by God. And so I'm sort of riffing on that and talking about another way of thinking of myself, which is not that I am capital K known, but that I emerged from this trajectory of life's existence, and that the huge response that I have to that is just flat out gratitude. Wow, lucky me. And it doesn't matter whether I'm known or not.
Great, thank you. Another question. Can you say a little about how collective intelligence is a different identity than individual intelligence? Can't something be emerging from collective intelligence that is closer to the path Alexander called the universe's tendency toward deity?
Well, I don't know Alexander's tendency toward deity. I think, though, that what I can respond to this by saying that there's, of course, collective intelligence. It's called cultures. Since we had the symbolic language in these narratives, we've started telling these stories to each other, remembering them, elaborating on them, discarding them in favor of ones that we like better. Different cultures have different stories and emphasize different features of their circumstances. And so we now have an overwhelming collective intelligence, one that, ChatGPT can now plug into and come up with all sorts of stuff on its own. And this collective intelligence, I think we could say, is an incredible example of an emergent property. It's nothing but all of the various bits and pieces of our understandings that have come together into this whole.
Yeah, and even I would say science flows in that collective understanding, right? I mean, we sometimes
Oh yeah,
have
well,
the
science is part of culture. I'm sorry, I should have made that clear. Yeah, culture is science, humanities, social sciences, the whole shebang. Yeah.
great. Next question. We tend to think, or at least to speak of evolution as what has happened leading to us now. But evolution is ongoing. Everything is changing, evolving even now. So it could be said that we are still at a very early stage in the possible history of intelligent life on our planet, and perhaps also of spiritual life. Where do you think we might be going evolutionarily and religiously or spiritually?
Okay, so evolution happens really slowly. There are examples, if it doesn't happen slowly if you're an animal breeder and you intentionally select two individuals that you like and ask them to selectively have offspring. You can get quite remarkable. You can get dachshunds and greyhounds that way. But if you let evolution go its own course, it takes a long time. So as I said, the oldest human Homo sapiens remains that we know of in Africa are 300,000 years ago. So 300,000 years to our present time, to triple our brains, to develop language and so on. That's a long time. 300,000 years is more time than we can really imagine, even though it's an eye blink in terms of the history of evolution writ large. So if we're looking for humans to evolve, my sense is that absent a lot of inbreeding, and of course, some kinds of selective sexual selection does go on, but the main way that we're changing is via these cultures. We're building these cultures. We're building our scientific understandings and our stories that we tell, and cultures evolve overnight. A kid's Nike sneakers, one day they don't exist, and the next day every kid in the United States needs to have their Air Jordans. So the cultural evolution is very rapid, and I see that we humans pretty much ought to take what we are. We've got plenty of space up here to do stuff. We're pretty good. And to evolve ourselves in terms of our cultural practices, our ecological practices, our ways of cohabiting the planet in sustainable ways.
There's another evolution question, although not quite so positive as the last one. I believe that Homo sapiens has evolved to be something like a lethal cancer on the Earth, that their activities will lead to the imminent extinctions of many species, including themselves. Do you have similar thoughts or beliefs?
No, I think humans are wonderful. I think we've had some really uncool stories and cultural premises that what a lot of us are trying to do now is to replace these with stories that are earth nourishing and nourishing in general. I don't think that we certainly have aggression. We certainly can be selfish and mean and cruel. I'm not sugarcoating things, but we also know that those are sins. We have already named them as sins. We know what we mean by a virtuous life, a life that's reverent, a life that's courageous. We have lots of models going back not only to our religious texts, but our philosophical texts. And so we know what we should be doing. And I think we can get there. I am very optimistic, actually. And whoever the pessimistic person is, I hope you change your mind.
The next is a question. I'm not quite sure it's worded well, but maybe when I read it, you'll understand it. Your second edition has a wonderfully updated bibliography. Trying to get a perspective on various interpretations of religious naturalism seems overwhelming. Would Mary Jane Rubenstein's survey, Pantheologies, Gods, Worlds, Monsters, offer positions that have any competition?
Well, Mary Jane isn't trying to articulate religious naturalist orientation writ large. She's very interested in, and she's a professor at Wesleyan, so this is a scholarly work. She's very interested in the history of pantheistic thought in particular, and all of its synonyms. And she does Spinoza, she does Einstein, as well as the pagans, as well as process thought. So it's a scholarly work, and she's not really trying to do the same thing that I am. The bibliography for the religious naturalism part, yes, I agree it's long, but it was very important for me in writing the book to lift up all my fellow travelers, all the other people who are using their voices to tell versions of this story from their own experience, from their own backgrounds, their own ethnic backgrounds, and all the other ways that we humans come to the table. And if it's too long a list and you're curious, just close your eyes and point to one and check it out on Amazon and see if the description of it makes it sound like it's something that you'd like to read. I didn't want to prioritize them. That I don't think I could have. It would have been too hard.
Great. Now, what I have left are 2 comments. So I'm going to read the first comment, and Ursula, you can just say I agree or disagree, or you can actually make a comment if you want. It's up to you. The first one is, what we need is a new metaphysics with emphasis on intersubjectivity of everything with everything else.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, we're all made up of matter. It's all matter, energy. It's all therefore moving through and joining and relationship and disruption of relationship. So that is the way the things on the planetary matrix and in the cosmos work. I'm not so I guess I agree with that. I wish the person were here so we could make sure I got it.
And this is the final comment that I have. This one is rather long. The physicist Frank Wychick says deep truth often requires one to accept that it is necessary to embrace 2 opposing truths, which are both true at the same time, but can only be understood one at a time. For example, particle and wave radiation. My faith is not supernatural with a capital S, but super with a small s, capital natural. That is, I need both science and religion for my modest understanding of faith and science to feel awe and whole as a person.
Okay, go for it. I mean, that's great. There are things about the quantum world and the cosmological world that we don't understand, that don't make sense, that are in the kinds of ways that we think about materiality. And we have come a long way since the original Greeks were just talking about things being made up of atoms. We certainly know a lot more, but we certainly don't understand everything at either of those levels. We understand a lot more about biology, and it's important to stress that when life started on Earth, let's say 3.5 billion years ago, the first life forms had to use the materials at hand. That was what was available. So they used atoms that have subatomic particles that have weird properties that we don't yet understand. But life just kind of said, okay, this is what we got. What can we do with this to make something that has aims and is a self? So the fact that there are contradictions and things that we don't understand at the quantum level, for example, is something that I just take as a matter of course.
Great, thanks, Ursula. That's on the question box. I'm going to join in with one question, just because we're both biologists. So, so there's been a lot of work recently on Deinococcus radiodurans, the organism that they found from nuclear power plants. It's so resistant to radiation that it can live in huge doses. And I wonder, I sometimes think that is an example of modern evolution that's happening in front of our eyes, because these organisms would never have been exposed to radiation at those doses without nuclear power. And I wonder what you're thinking about that is.
Sure. So that critter survived when most of the other critters at Chernobyl or wherever it was found died off, and lucky it. And that trait probably wouldn't have happened if it had been evolving in some other ecosystem. And so, of course, we have also with our antibiotics, created antibiotic resistant microbes of all sorts. And again, you could say that they never would have happened if we hadn't put the antibiotic pressures on them to survive in our hospitals and clinics. So yeah, that's true. But I mean, there are pressures, pressures that come from the environment, that come from other organisms. That's how evolution works. So the fact that we have exerted evolutionary influence is true, but so have many other organisms by virtue of what they hunt, by virtue of how they camouflage themselves. There's just a whole lot of different ways that different organisms influence each other in their evolutionary trajectories.
Great, thank you. Last question goes to Maynard. Maynard, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Ursula. I resonate with virtually everything in your book. And I just want to have you reflect for a moment on the concept of natural itself. Is natural, is the word natural, is the concept natural a planetary concept? Can we extend that concept off the planet Earth? Because if there is extension of the human species, at least beyond planet Earth at some point, it's essentially going to be a synthetic environment. And so I just am inquiring about the scope, the boundaries of the word natural, and to the extent that we can apply it off planet.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to help you much with off planet, but I think that one of the things that you're moving toward that I think is important, and I'll lift it up, I'll just read a few sentences from my book on this, which is the difference between science and technology, because technology is really what you're talking about. Science and technology, although interwoven, are distinct enterprises. Science entails discovering how the natural world works. Technology entails the use of these understandings to make things. Technology was practiced by our early ancestors when they used their knowledge of the natural world to forge weapons and cutlery and develop herbal medicines and agriculture. Virologists who study the coronavirus infection process are doing science. Bioengineers who use these understandings to create vaccines are doing technology. Mm-hmm. So nature just is, as far as we know, it's the same throughout the cosmos. And then that some of that nature has come to form our planetary matrix, our Earth and its beings. And then humans have come along, and there's some kinds of technology, for example, with ants building nests and so on, where organisms take their understanding of nature and use it to make things. And your colonies of humans that are going to go off to other planets are going to do so where nature is going to be the same. Whatever planet we go to, it's still going to have atoms of oxygen and carbon and iron on them, but we will be there because of the technologies that we have developed to build the rockets and the life support systems.
Okay.
Does that help? I don't know.
Thank you. I will go back.
So there's natural and non-natural things, if you want to make that distinction, even here on the Earth, and that would be the case if we went to another planet using our technologies.
Okay, thank you. I'll go back to take another look at that section. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Always good to see you, Ursula.
Same here, baby.
And appreciate your presentation. And thank you, Gail, for your job today, and to JD